Their killings stand out as one of Chicago's most infamous unsolved cases. Today we're discussing the Grimes sisters' murders. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Due to the graphic subject matter of this episode, it is not appropriate for delicate ears. Listener discretion is advised. 1956, the United States presidential election was held on November 6th of that year, with incumbent Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower defeating Democratic challenger Adlai Stevenson in a rematch of the 1952 election. The Chicago Defender, a prominent black newspaper, became a daily paper on February 6, 1956, making it the nation's second black daily newspaper and the largest black-owned paper in the world. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his first major address in Chicago on April 13, 1956, at Rockefeller Memorial Chapel at the University of Chicago. National Tea, a major Chicago grocery chain, was bought by a Canadian company when its sales topped $600 million, nearly $7 billion in today's dollars. The average yearly salary in 1956 was slightly more than $3,500, and a gallon of gas would cost you 30 cents. Initially settled by Irish immigrants in the 1830s, over time the McKinley Park neighborhood on Chicago's southwest side became home to various immigrant groups, including Germans, Swedes, English, Poles, and other Central Europeans. McKinley Park has long been an industrial area of Chicago with steel mills, brickyards, and other blue-collar employers providing jobs for working-class families. Established in 1905, the 260-acre Central Manufacturing District Industrial Park was still humming late into the 1950s, and many of McKinley Park's 2- and 4-flat buildings were developed in the 1950s and early 60s. One family residing in McKinley Park in the late 1950s was the Grimes family. Barbara Grimes, 15, and her sister Patricia, 3 days shy of her 13th birthday, lived with their mother Loretta and 3 other siblings in their home at 3634 South Damon Avenue. Loretta and the children's father, Joseph, a truck driver, had divorced years earlier but remained cordial, with Joseph still involved in their children's lives. Barbara, a sophomore at Kelly High School at 4100 South California Avenue, was known as the serious one, and Patricia, or Petey as she was called by her family, was a high-spirited 7th grader at St. Maurice Catholic Elementary School, not far from the family's home. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were inseparable, sharing a love of Elvis Presley, having recently joined Presley's official fan club. On the evening of December 28, 1956, the sisters made plans to see Presley's new film, Love Me Tender, at the Brighton Theater at 4223 South Archer Avenue, roughly 1.5 miles from their home. It was reportedly the 11th time they had seen the movie. Before departing, the girl sat with her siblings and mother for a meal of tuna fish and sweet and white potatoes. While Barbara ate her usual amount, Patricia ate sparingly, allegedly because she had eaten ice cream with her brothers earlier that day. The sisters left home around 7:30 p.m. with $2.50, enough to cover movie tickets and the bus ride back, telling their mother they would be home before midnight. Several witnesses recalled seeing the girls at the theater and that they stayed the whole time up until the end of the film, where Elvis's character Clint Reno is killed and Presley's face is superimposed over the final credits, singing the title song. Barbara and Patricia Grimes walked out of the theater, onto Archer Avenue, and then vanished. When the girls failed to return by their curfew, Mrs. Grimes became concerned. She sent the girls' older sister Teresa, 17, and brother Joey, 14, to wait at the bus stop at 35th and Hoyne, but after 3 buses passed with no sign of Barbara and Patricia, the siblings returned home by themselves. Growing increasingly worried, Loretta called the girls' friends, hopeful the sisters might have gone to one of their homes after the movie, but no one had seen them. At 2:15 a.m. on December 29th, Loretta Grimes contacted the Chicago Police Department about her missing daughters. The following morning, local police and District 20 detectives began their investigation. Initially, police were insistent that the girls were with friends or had possibly run away. Loretta Grimes explained that her daughters were good girls and would never do something like that. On Monday, the Chicago Daily Tribune newspaper carried the story of the missing Grimes girls on page 6, with much written about the various places they had been seen by others. This was not only New Year's Eve day, but also Patricia's 13th birthday. In addition to fears about the safety of her missing daughters, Loretta Grimes was still mourning the loss of her second oldest child, Leona, who had moved out years earlier and gotten married. Leona died in August of 1954, at the age of 26, after a kidney operation at Holy Cross Hospital. Police canvassed the neighborhood, going door to door, talking with neighbors, searching alleys, garages, anywhere they thought the girls might have gone after the theater. Railroad detectives joined the search of the Santa Fe railroad yards, fearful the girls might be locked in one of the rail cars. Soon hundreds of police officers were assigned to the case full-time, assisted by law enforcement from surrounding suburbs. As news of the missing girls spread, hundreds of local volunteers joined in the search efforts. Rivers and canals were dredged. Joseph Grimes, the girls' father, enlisted fellow truck drivers to search for his daughters. Students at Patricia's school, St. Maurice, assembled and mailed flyers with pictures and descriptions of the girls to roughly 15,000 area homes. Parishioners from the church offered a $1,000 reward, roughly $11,000 today, for information about Barbara and Patricia, hopeful someone might come forward. A cab driver claimed he saw the sisters on December 30th at a Skid Row diner located on Madison Street with two men, one reportedly with sideburns like Elvis. A Damon Avenue CTA bus driver identified the girls as passengers on January 1st. Workers at a Kresge's Five and Dime store claimed to have seen the girls listening to Elvis records with two sailors on January 3rd. A woman in Minnesota reported encountering the sisters in a Nashville bus station restroom on January 9th. Officials at the Great Lakes Naval Base north of Chicago investigated whether two teenage sailors, possibly named Larry and Terry, might have had recent contact with the sisters after having met the girls at a theater a few months back. The sailors were eventually identified and their whereabouts on the night the Grimes sisters went missing confirmed. In addition to the many well-intentioned but misguided people who called in with tips, there were those whose intentions were not helpful and some downright cruel. On one cold night in early January, Teresa Grimes received a call from someone who told her that her sisters' bodies had been dumped in garbage cans behind the Brighton Theater. Local police searched the alley and found nothing. Another call from a young girl was answered by Loretta Grimes. When she picked up the phone, a young girl said, "It's Petey, this is Petey," using Patricia's nickname, then hung up. Barbara and Patricia's mother reportedly cried an hour after the call. It wasn't until 1 week after the girls went missing that the Chicago Tribune included the story of their disappearance on page 1, but put their pictures on page 2. While some calls were placed directly to the family home, others were sent elsewhere, tying up police resources at crucial times in the investigation. A young man called the downtown office on January 10th, less than 2 weeks after the girls' disappearance, and said, "Do you know the parking lot in Grant Park? There's a 13-year-old girl tied up in the trunk of my car in the parking lot." Police hurriedly scoured half a dozen nearby parking lots, searching 3,000 cars, finding nothing. 2 days later, Loretta Grimes made a trip to Milwaukee after receiving 3 letters demanding $1,000 for her daughter's safe return. Escorted by FBI agents, she followed the instructions, first going to a department store, then a hotel, and finally a Catholic church. The letters claimed Barbara Grimes would enter the church, retrieve the money from Mrs. Grimes, and deliver it to the kidnapper, at which time the sisters would be released. Loretta Grimes waited hours, fearing the worst, without anyone ever coming to get the money. The letters were later found to have been sent by a mental patient at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Lake County, Illinois. 3 days after the Milwaukee trip, police received a call from a man who said, quote, "You'll find the bodies of the Grimes girls in Santa Fe Park. I saw them there." The voice claimed this vision came to him in a dream. A search of the property turned up nothing. Santa Fe Park at 91st and Wolf Road in Willow Springs would become the Santa Fe Speedway in 1953. While the caller with vivid dreams didn't identify himself, police were able to trace the call to Green's Liquor Market on South Halsted, where the caller was identified as Walter Kranz, a 53-year-old steam fitter who claimed to be psychic. Kranz was one of many people questioned and released. That same week, police in Chicago called off a 100-man search team looking for the Grimes sisters after they were reportedly spotted in Nashville, possibly headed to Elvis Presley's home in Memphis. Roughly 50 other runaway teenage girls had been picked up in the Memphis area during the previous month, with each claiming they were headed to Graceland. Knowing the Grimes sisters' love of Elvis Presley, authorities asked the singer to reach out to the girls, and in his public plea on national radio on January 19, 1957, Elvis advised, quote, "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." Loretta Grimes steadfastly claimed her daughters would never have done something so impulsive. As the search dragged on with no results, fears grew that something sinister had befallen Barbara and Patricia. "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me," the girls' mother, Loretta, pleaded in a January 1957 Chicago Tribune article. Sadly, that call would never come. More than 3 weeks after they went missing, the mystery of the Grimes sisters' disappearance came to a tragic end on January 22, 1957. 39-year-old Leonard Prescott was driving along German Church Road near Willow Springs, then a rural area southwest of Chicago, when he spotted what appeared to be two discarded store mannequins behind a guardrail near Devil's Creek. Unsure of what he had seen, Prescott returned to the site with his wife, Marie. Upon closer inspection, they realized with horror that the forms were the nude, frozen bodies of two young girls. The Prescotts and law enforcement returned to the area where police saw for themselves the two girls lying in a ditch about 10 feet off the road. One was face down in the snow, with the second girl lying face up near the other's body. While police were certain the bodies in the snow were the Grimes sisters, they brought Joseph Grimes, the girl's father, to the site to make a positive ID. Preparing for the worst, he arrived at the scene, and as he looked down at the pale, frozen, lifeless bodies, Joseph Grimes began sobbing. Choking back tears, he said, "Yes, those are my daughters." The 25-day search was over. The focus now shifted from a missing persons case to a murder investigation. The mystery of what happened to these girls was just beginning.
Hi, I'm Ben Orlando, host of Midnight Library of Baseball, a nighttime podcast about the overlooked and misunderstood stories in the game. How did emotional vulnerability lead to extreme innovation? What is the truth behind baseball's biggest villains? How did gambling nearly destroy the game? If you want to think about baseball and life in a different way, stop by the library and settle in. A link's in the show notes.
Law enforcement officials swarmed to the scene, headed by Cook County Sheriff Joseph Lohman and Harry Gloss, an investigator for head coroner Walter E. McCarran. Both surmised the bodies had likely been lying there for days, possibly as long as a week and a half. Soon more than 160 officers from various agencies, including the Chicago Police, Cook County Sheriff's Department, Forest Preserve officials, and 5 suburban police departments began searching the woods, contaminating everything under their feet. The discovery of the Grimes sisters' bodies sent shockwaves through Chicago. Their father, Joseph Grimes, told reporters, quote, "I tried to tell police my daughters didn't run away, but they didn't listen to me." The killings of the Grimes sisters was the second multiple murder of children in the Chicago area in a span of 15 months. In October 1955, less than a year and a half before the Grimes sisters were found, 3 Chicago boys, John Schuschler, 13, his brother Anton, 11, and Robert Peterson, 14, disappeared after seeing a movie downtown. Their naked, bound bodies were found 2 days later in a forest preserve ditch, discarded on the side of the road, much like those of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Could these murders somehow be connected? In addition to the police officials at the scene, reporters showed up by the dozens, many getting close enough to the bodies to comment on the condition of the girls, pointing out 3 wounds in Patricia's abdomen and bruising on both girls' faces. When word of the discovery of her daughter's bodies reached Loretta Grimes, she wept uncontrollably, insisting that the police never believed her when she said her daughters wouldn't have run away. The girls' bodies were taken to the Cook County morgue, where they would be stored until properly thawed for an autopsy. Investigators stayed behind near Devil's Creek to search for the sisters' clothing and clues, but nothing turned up. The initial autopsy proved inconclusive. Despite evidence of a struggle and the mysterious puncture wounds on the bodies, the official cause of death was listed only as shock and exposure. Analysts could not even agree on when exactly the girls died. The frigid temperatures had preserved the bodies unusually well, complicating efforts to determine a precise time of death. An examination of the girls' stomachs showed undigested tuna and potatoes in Barbara's stomach, meaning she died just a few hours after consuming dinner with her family the night they left for the theater. Patricia, who had eaten far less that night, had little in her stomach left undigested. Neither had alcohol in their system. The outpouring of support and sympathy from the community was unlike anything the Grimes family expected. Neighbors brought food to their door and dropped off cards and letters, often containing money to help with expenses, as Loretta had been unable to work after her daughters went missing. A group of neighborhood girls went door to door asking for donations, raising $253 for the family, slightly more than $2,800 today. The Back of the Yard's neighborhood council set up a fund and received donations by mail, some of which Mrs. Grimes would use to buy clothing for herself and the other children for Barbara and Patricia's funeral. Wolschlager Funeral Home, across the street from the Grimes family parish, St. Maurice, conducted the service free of charge, and St. Maurice Church provided grave sites for the girls. As police scrambled to identify a suspect or possibly suspects, they cast a wide net, reportedly interviewing more than 300,000 people. On January 27, 1957, 5 days after the grim discovery on German Church Road, police announced they had obtained a confession from a suspect named Edward Benny Bedwell, a 21-year-old drifter who had worked as a dishwasher on Chicago's Skid Row, a stretch of Madison Street west of downtown, known for its sketchy bars, one-hour motel rooms, and sidewalks littered with trash. Bedwell was a former circus worker who had briefly served in the military. Bedwell wore his hair like Elvis and even had sideburns similar to the ones the cab driver spotted back on December 30th, when he says he saw the girls walking in the area with 2 men. After several days in custody, Bedwell signed a statement admitting he and an accomplice named Frank had killed the Grimes sisters. According to Bedwell's confession, he and Frank met Barbara and Patricia at a tavern on January 7th, then spent a week together at various motels. But on January 13th, when the girls resisted the men's advances, Bedwell claimed he and Frank knocked them unconscious and dumped their bodies in a ditch. On January 28, 1957, one day after police obtained the Bedwell confession, the closed-casket funeral mass for Patricia and Barbara Grimes was held at St. Maurice Church at 3615 South Hoyne Avenue. As the funeral cortege made a 45-minute trip to Holy Sepulchre Catholic Cemetery at 6001 West 111th Street in Alsip, Illinois, it passed the Grimes home, Kelly High School, where Barbara was a student, and St. Maurice Grade School, where Patricia attended. A weeping crowd of 300 friends and neighbors gathered at the gravesite. As a light snow fell and a bitter wind swept past, Mrs. Grimes prayed softly, murmuring, "Take care of them." Near exhaustion, the Grimes families left the two coffins and slowly walked 10 feet to another grave nearby. As Father Joseph pushed snow away from the tombstone, Mother Loretta said a prayer for their daughter Leona, who had died 2 years before. Bedwell's friend Frank was soon identified as 26-year-old William Willingham, who was easy for police to find as he was serving a city jail sentence for drunkenness. Willingham admitted he was with Bedwell and two girls, but denied ever having seen the Grimes sisters. As excited as police were to have a confession from a suspect in this high-profile murder, Benny Bedwell's story quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Medical experts had concluded the girls died on or shortly after December 28th, not January 13th. Bedwell's work time card provided an alibi for the night the sisters disappeared. Bedwell's defense attorney insisted the confession had been coerced after 4 days of intense interrogation, during which time, according to Bedwell, the sheriff's men beat and kicked me. Sheriff Lohman went on to say he considered Bedwell the prime suspect in the case, quote, even more so now than when we first took his confession, end quote, although he did not elaborate. Two teenage cousins named Irene Dean, age 19, and Carol King, age 18, would later inform investigators they had likely been the two girls seen by the cab driver accompanied by Bedwell and Willingham near the Skid Row Diner in the early hours of either December 29th or 30th. With Bedwell having retracted his statement, police went back to their files where they found a report made on December 30th, less than 48 hours after the girls were reported missing, that had gotten lost at the police station. Two youths, Earl Zastro, 15, and Eddie Lorden, 17, claimed they saw the Grimes sisters darting in and out of doorways 2 blocks from their home around 11:30 p.m. on the night they went missing. The boys said they had known the sisters for 4 to 6 months and easily recognized them. Commenting on the possibility the girls were close to home when they vanished, Lieutenant James McMahon of the Homicide Squad said, quote, there is no doubt in our minds that the answer to the Grimes mystery lies right in the area of the girls' home. They disappeared in that area. Either they were kidnapped there or willingly got into the car of someone they knew. Either way, the trail starts there. End quote. By February 5th, the charges against Bedwell were dropped and he was released on bond. Cook County Sheriff Joseph Lohman and Chief Investigator Harry Gloss objected, believing Bedwell was still responsible despite the discrepancies in his confession. With their prime suspect cleared, investigators went back to square one. Various theories emerged about what may have happened to Barbara and Patricia. One possibility was that the girls had gotten into a car with local teenage boys, possibly members of a gang, who then harmed them. A witness reported seeing Barbara talking to youths in a car the night she vanished, with one boy telling her, "You'll be sorry." According to a 1997 story about this case in the Chicago Reader, this was not a good time to be a teen boy on the Southwest Side. Quote, "We were afraid to be outside," recalled Marvin Ahern, a neighborhood teenager at the time. "The police would see us just walking down the street and pick us up for questioning." End quote. In February of 1957, a coroner's inquest was held at which the official verdict was returned that stated the Grimes sisters were indeed murdered, dying of secondary shock due to exposure to low temperatures. The inquest failed to clarify conflicting testimony, including that of Benny Bedwell, who was free on $20,000 bond. Loretta Grimes, Patricia and Barbara's mother, posted a list of 13 questions at the inquest, including, "The illiterate, lying Madison Street Bedwell says he was out drinking in dives, having as many as 8 rounds of drinks at one time, and that the girls slept with him and took part frequently in sexual acts. What is there to prove this? Our girls look like children and did not look fully mature and physically developed for their age. How could they be taken by saloon keepers as adults? Would a tavern keeper risk his license selling liquor to mere children? Do you think my darlings suffered much or were tortured before they died?" Loretta Grimes reportedly saw Benny Bedwell's mother, Ethel Bradbury, in the hearing room and said to her, "I don't think your boy did it. We want you to know how sorry we are." The Grimes sisters' case took an unexpected turn on Friday, February 15, 1957, when Harry Gloss, chief investigator for the Cook County coroner, challenged the findings of medical experts. Gloss, a former policeman with 20 years' experience, claimed, quote, "Only half of the story had been told," end quote, charging that the Grimes sisters had both been beaten and at least one had been sexually assaulted before they were slain. "This may cost me my job, but I cannot sleep knowing things are being covered up," Gloss said. "I was in the room for 5 hours while the pathologist conducted the autopsy. I know what I saw and heard. It is time some of that came out." Gloss challenged the expert's opinion that the girls died within hours after leaving home and remained convinced Benny Bedwell was responsible. Loretta Grimes was reportedly so upset by Harry Gloss's claims, reported in the newspapers, she needed to seek medical care. The following day, Coroner Walter McCarran issued a press release that read, in part, "Gloss's statement merely refutes the scientific findings of the leading toxicologist's 35 years of experience in this part of the country and 3 top pathologists with 80 years combined experience." Gloss was fired that day. Concrete evidence in the case of the Grimes sisters' murders remained elusive. As weeks turned to months and then years, the trail grew increasingly cold. The murders of these 2 teenage girls faded into Chicago legend, a disturbing unsolved mystery that continues to haunt the city. For Loretta Grimes, the loss of her daughters was a wound that never fully healed. She steadfastly maintained that Barbara and Patricia were good girls who would never run away voluntarily, even as early speculation focused on that possibility. In the years after the murders, Loretta reported receiving strange phone calls that seemed connected to the case. In 1957, an unknown male caller claimed he was, quote, "the one that undressed the girls," end quote. Then in September 1958, around the time another teenage girl named Bonnie Lee Scott was found murdered near Chicago, Loretta received another call from a similar-sounding voice saying he, quote, "got away with another one." These unsettling calls only added to Loretta's anguish and conviction that her daughter's killer remained at large. Slightly more than 4 years after the Grimes sisters went missing from their home in McKinley Park, a 9-year-old girl named Gloria Kowalowitz disappeared during a 3-block walk to St. Mary's of Mount Carmel Church at 6700 South Hermitage in the city's southwest side. Her body was found the next morning. She had been shot twice in the head, then dumped in a forest preserve not far from where the Grimes sisters' bodies were found. Gloria Kowalowitz had become the 9th child-slaying victim within 5 years. At that time, 8 of the 9 slayings remained unsolved. In December of 1962, a 34-year-old mechanic living in Los Angeles named Alfred Smith Lawless confessed to police in California that he was responsible for the deaths of the Grimes sisters after blacking out during a night of heavy drinking. Police in California and in Chicago immediately spotted several discrepancies in Lawless's story. Lawless claimed that he met the sisters as they left a theater at State and Lake, roughly 7 miles from the Brighton Theater. He then claimed they stopped at a drive-in somewhere and shared hamburgers and soft drinks with him, which contradicted the coroner's report of the sisters' stomach contents at death. Lawless also claimed he tied up the girls before strangling them and dumping their bodies, which also contradicted the coroner's report. While Lawless had spent time in Chicago throughout the years, his descriptions were vague or just plain incorrect. When told of Lawless's confession, Loretta Grimes, then 56, said there were holes in the story. Lawless, an Army veteran, had spent some time in various mental institutions, and his confession was soon disregarded by authorities. Years after the murders, Mrs. Grimes had a chance encounter with Sandra Forgala, who had been a classmate of the Grimes sisters. Forgala recounted that one of the first things Loretta said was, "Did you hear about my girls?" The pain and need for closure was still evident decades later. Though the trail has long since gone cold, the Grimes sisters' murders continue to fascinate amateur sleuths and crime historians. In recent years, some potential new leads have emerged that may shed light on the 6-decade-old mystery. Some amateur investigators believe Charles Leroy Melquist, who was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott near Chicago in 1958, may have been connected to the Grimes killings. Melquist had confessed to killing Scott and served 11 years of a 99-year sentence before being released. He went on to marry and have children before his death in 2010. While never charged in the Grimes case, some investigators believe Melquist may have been responsible for both crimes. Decades later, the Grimes case remains lodged in Chicago's collective memory. Their murders are still discussed, debated, and researched by those fascinated by unsolved crimes and local history. Today, over 65 years after Barbara and Patricia Grimes were murdered, their case officially remains open. The Cook County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit continues to solicit tips and information from the public. While physical evidence from the 1950s investigation may have degraded or been lost over time, advances in forensic technology offer some hope. If DNA samples were preserved from the crime scene or victims' bodies, modern analysis techniques could potentially yield new clues. It took 40 years for someone to be arrested in the Schuessler-Peterson murders, but justice was finally served when Kenneth Hansen was tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. Hansen died behind bars at Pontiac Correctional Center at the age of 74. For the remaining members of the Grimes family and others touched by this tragedy, the need for closure remains. While the passage of time makes it increasingly unlikely the killer will ever face justice in court, uncovering the full truth of what happened that winter night in 1956 might provide some measure of peace. I didn't find much about Benny Bedwell after his time caught up in the Grimes sisters' tragedy, although I do know his life was relatively short. Bedwell died in November of 1972 at the age of 37, and is buried in a military cemetery in St. Louis County in Missouri. The Brighton Theater remained in operation until 1991 when it closed. It was demolished in 2003, and an empty lot is there today. St. Maurice Elementary School, where Barbara attended and Patricia was a 7th grader when she was killed, closed in 2001. St. Maurice Church, where the girls' funeral mass was held, closed in 2020. Wolschlager Funeral Home is still in operation across the street from the deconsecrated church. Family patriarch Joseph Grimes died in June of 1965 at the age of 57. Brother James Grimes, who was just 11 at the time of his sister's murders, said in 2013 that he welcomed what he saw as a public, quote, reopening of the case, stating, "I just assumed it was never going to be solved, but maybe there's hope." James Grimes died in August of 2022. Teresa Grimes, who waited at the bus stop for her 2 sisters that fateful night, still lives in the Chicago area. Barbara and Patricia Grimes are buried alongside each other on the southeastern part of Section 37 in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois. Their mother, Loretta, continued to push for answers in the case until her death in 1989 at the age of 83. Loretta Grimes is buried near her daughters. Thanks for listening to today's episode about the Grimes sisters' murders. As always, if you have questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to various books about this subject if you'd like to learn more. Anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. The original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Thanks, Johnny! If you need creative work done for anything you have going on, send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.